There were 4 people at the table. I had prepared for 3. The email had said, panel interview, 3 members, which I had researched and rehearsed and prepared for, with the specific thoroughness of someone who has wanted this job for a long time and does not intend to leave anything to chance. 3 names on the panel. 3 sets of likely questions, 3 professional histories I'd read carefully enough to know what each person would want to hear. The 4th chair was occupied by someone who had not been in the email. She was at the far end of the table, slightly turned from the others, with a notepad and a pen, and the expression of someone who is there to observe rather than participate. Mid-30s, perhaps. Dark cardigan. The kind of stillness that doesn't announce itself. I looked at her once when I came in, noted the 4th chair, filed it, and delivered my opening the way I had prepared it, direct, specific. The argument for why I was the right person laid out in the right order. They asked their questions. I answered them. It went well. By the measure of these things, clean answers, good eye contact, the particular energy of a room that is already leaning in your direction. At the end, the panel chair said, "Does anyone have a final question?" The woman at the end of the table looked up from her notepad. She said, "I have one." She asked me why I had applied now. Specifically, not why I wanted the role, the standard version of that question. But why now? What had changed? What had made this the moment? It was the most precise question I had been asked. I answered it honestly, which is what precise questions require. And when I finished, she nodded once and wrote something down and did not say anything else. I got the offer 4 days later. My name is Thomas Achebe. I'm 35. I'm a financial analyst, which means I spend my professional life reading numbers for what they are not saying, finding the story underneath the data, the thing the balance sheet is trying not to show you, the place where the gap between what is reported and what is real tells you everything you need to know. It is, professionally speaking, a discipline of careful reading and uncomfortable questions, and I am good at it in the specific way of someone who learned early that the most important information is usually adjacent to the obvious information rather than inside it. I started the role on a Monday in October. I had been in the building 40 minutes when the head of my department, a man named Gerald Voss, who ran the place with the organized warmth of someone who had long ago made peace with how much he loved his work, stopped me in the corridor outside my new office and said, "You met my daughter at the interview." I said I had met 4 people at the interview. He said, "The one at the end of the table." I thought about the dark cardigan, the precise question, the notepad. I said, "I didn't know she was your daughter." He said, "She asked to sit in. She does that occasionally. She has a sense for people." He said it without apparent agenda, just offering information the way people offer context when they think it might be useful. She said, "You were the right one." I said I was glad to hear it. He said, "She's usually right about these things," and walked on. And I stood in the corridor of my new job with a file under my arm and the specific feeling of information that is adjacent to something important and that I did not yet have the surrounding context to understand. Her name was Clara Voss. She ran her own consultancy, Strategic Communications, the kind of work that requires understanding what an organization is actually saying versus what it intends to say, which I noted privately was not entirely unlike what I did, from a different angle. She used her mother's surname professionally, which was why she hadn't appeared in the names I'd researched. She came into the office occasionally to see her father, and occasionally to attend the quarterly stakeholder briefings where outside consultants were invited. And that was the formal inventory of her presence in the building. The informal inventory was different. I ran into her in the building's coffee room on my third day. She was reading something on her phone, and she looked up when I came in and said, without preamble, "The question I asked you in the interview." I said, "Why now?" She said, "Yes. You said, because the timing of a decision is part of the decision, and this was the right timing, and I've learned not to argue with right timing." She put the phone down. "Where did you learn that?" I said. "A bad investment, years ago. I held it too long because the fundamentals were good, and I lost money I could have saved because I was reading the right data and ignoring the timing." She said, "You applied that to a career move." I said, "I apply it to most things." She looked at me for a moment with the same quality of attention she had brought to the interview table, evaluative, present, the kind that doesn't look away while it's working. Then she said, "Good answer," and went back to her phone, and I made my coffee. And that was that. Except it wasn't that. It was the beginning of a thing I spent the following several months not examining directly, which I was aware was my own bad investment logic applied incorrectly to a personal situation, and which I chose to do anyway, because some things require a particular kind of timing, and I had not yet located it. Clara came into the building perhaps once a fortnight. When she did, she occasionally passed through the area where my office was, and occasionally we spoke, and the conversations had the quality I had noticed in the coffee room: direct, no pleasantries used as filler, the specific rhythm of two people who both find the gap between what is said and what is meant more interesting than either on its own. She asked questions that were adjacent to the obvious question. I did the same. We were, I understood at some point around month 4, performing the same professional skill at each other as a form of conversation, which meant we were each reading the other the way we read our respective subjects, and finding the story underneath what was stated. I found a great deal. I did not say what I found. There was also the matter of what she had said in the interview, or what Gerald had told me she had said, which I had filed in the category of professional judgment, and declined to examine more closely, because examining it more closely would require asking questions I was not ready to ask about timing. 8 months in, she stopped me in the corridor outside Gerald's office. Not formally. She had been leaving, and I had been arriving, and she said, "Do you have 5 minutes?" In the voice of someone who is asking the question and has already decided on the answer. I said I did. We went to the small meeting room at the end of the corridor that no one books because the heating is unreliable. She closed the door. She sat in the chair nearest the window, and I sat across from her, and she put her notepad on the table without opening it, which I had come to understand meant she was not working. She said, "I need to tell you something. I'm going to be direct about it, because that's how I do things, and I think you'd find anything other than direct fairly annoying." I said, "I would." She said, "When I sat in on that interview, I wasn't there to evaluate candidates for the panel. I was there because my father mentioned your name 3 weeks before, when he was considering who to bring in for the role, and I had heard your name before." I said, "Where?" She said, "A conference, 2 years ago. You gave a presentation on reading distortion and financial reporting. I was in the 3rd row." She looked at the notepad. "You said something about the gap between what numbers show and what they say, and how most people read the wrong layer, and I thought, that's the most precise thing I've heard anyone say about my own work from the other direction." I said, "I don't remember the conference specifically." She said, "I know, that's the asymmetry." She said it without distress, just naming it. "I remembered you. You had no reason to remember me." And then my father said your name, and I asked to sit in, and there you were, and you were exactly... She stopped. You were exactly what I thought. I sat with that for a moment. 8 months of corridor conversations and coffee room questions and the particular texture of a professional relationship that had been, I understood now, built on a foundation I hadn't known existed. The third row of a conference I couldn't specifically recall. 2 years of one person knowing something the other hadn't. I said, "The question you asked, why now?" She said, "Yes." I said, "You wanted to know if I could read timing." She said, "I wanted to know if you'd learned what I thought you'd learned from the presentation, whether it was just professional or whether it was applied." I said, "And?" She said, "You applied it. You said the right timing, and I've learned not to argue with it." She looked at me. That was the answer I was waiting for. I said, "Clara." She said, "I know how this sounds. Someone saying they picked you 2 years ago before you were in the same room, from 3 rows back at a conference. I know how it sounds." I said, "How does it sound?" She said, "Either very certain or very strange." I said, "Or both." She held my gaze. She said, "There's the complication of my father, of the building, of the professional adjacency." She set her hand flat on the notepad. "I'm not asking you to do anything with this. I've been carrying it for 2 years, and I thought you deserved to know it was there. That's all." I said, "That's not all." She looked at me. I said, "You closed the door." She was quiet. I said, "You don't close the door when you're just delivering information. You close the door when you're having the conversation that the information belongs to." She said, "That's very precise for 8 in the morning." I said, "I read things carefully. You know this." She said, "I know this." She looked at her notepad. "What do you read in this?" I said, "Someone who has been very patient with timing. Someone who asked the right question in the right room and got the answer she was looking for and has been deciding what to do with it ever since." I held her gaze. "I've been making the same decision." She said, "You have." I said, "Month 4, in the coffee room. You said good answer and went back to your phone, and I stood there with my coffee and thought, that is someone reading the gap. The same gap I read, and I filed it incorrectly for 4 months after that." She said, "How did you file it?" I said, "Professional interest." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I've reclassified." She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face did the thing it does when a calculation completes, not relief, more like precision, the particular satisfaction of a conclusion that holds. She said, "There's still my father." I said, "I know." She said, "And the building." I said, "I know." She said, "Those aren't small things." I said, "No, but they're known quantities. Known quantities can be managed." I held her gaze. "Unknown quantities are the ones that cost you." She said, "What's the unknown quantity here?" I said, "Whether the timing is right." She said, "What does your read say?" I said, "That we've both been waiting for someone to say it first. And you said it. So the timing is right." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the meeting room, the building was doing its morning thing, corridors filling, coffee room running, Gerald Voss somewhere being warmly organized about something. She said, "You said you've learned not to argue with right timing." I said, "I have." She said, "Then don't." She said it quietly, with the specific directness of someone who has waited 2 years for the right room and is not going to waste it on anything other than the obvious next thing. I did not argue. We were careful with Gerald. Not because we were hiding. Clara had a strong allergy to hiding things, which I had read correctly in the interview. But because we were careful people who understood that the order in which you present information matters as much as the information itself. We told him in month 3, over dinner at his house, over a meal he had clearly made with an effort that suggested he knew what was coming. And he listened and said very little, and then said, "She mentioned you. 2 years ago, when she came home from a conference." Clara said, "I mentioned a presentation." He said, "You described the person who gave it for approximately 40 minutes. She said, "That's an exaggeration." He said, "Clara, just her name." Then, "I'm glad it's you," looking at me. "She's been careful for a long time. She deserves someone who reads things correctly." He went to make tea. Clara looked at the table. I said, 40 minutes. She said, "It was a very good presentation." I said, "I don't remember the conference." She said, "I know, you've said." I said, "I remember it now." She looked at me. I said, "Third row, dark cardigan, left before the questions." She went very still. I said, "I didn't know your name. I noticed the person who left before the questions, because people who leave before the questions usually do it, because they already have what they came for." She said, "That's," I said, "You had what you came for." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You remember." I said, "I didn't remember the conference specifically." That was accurate. I remembered that. She looked at me with an expression I had been cataloging for 10 months and had not yet named. Not the interview precision, not the coffee room attention, not the meeting room honesty. Something that contained all of those and was also newer and more specific than any of them. She said, "Thomas." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is either the most financial analysis thing anyone has ever said to me or the most romantic." I said, "Both. They're the same thing done carefully." Gerald came back with the tea. He set it down and looked between us and said, "You're going to be exhausting to have at the same dinner table." He said it with the warmth of a man who found this very satisfying and did not intend to pretend otherwise. He was right. We were exhausting. We were also, I think, exactly what the other person needed. Someone who read the gap, asked the adjacent question, found the story underneath what was stated, and did not mistake precision for coldness or clarity for distance. 2 years of one person knowing something from 3 rows back. 10 months of corridor conversations and coffee rooms and careful filing. 1 door closed in a meeting room at 8 in the morning. The timing was right. I've learned not to argue with right timing. The notepad she'd brought to the meeting room that morning, that she'd set on the table without opening, I saw what was written on it, months later, when I borrowed it for something and it fell open. 1 page, near the front, from 2 years before. The date of the conference, and underneath it, 2 lines of her handwriting. Gap between what numbers show and what they say. Most people read the wrong layer. And then, underneath that in smaller writing that looked like an afterthought, "Find out who that was." She did. It took her 2 years, a panel interview, and a meeting room with unreliable heating. The timing was right. What would you have done if someone told you they'd already chosen you 2 years before you were in the same room? And have you ever had the strange experience of someone knowing something about you before you knew them, and discovering the knowing was mutual, just delayed? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.